I'm fine. You? Yeah, it's getting cold.
I often looked at Robinson, trying to gauge him. His gaze became unreadable, as neutral as that of a camera. His scrutiny suggested worlds where no secrets were left. Everything was under surveillance. Everything was videoed. The camera became the greatest instrument of power. There was the camera used by the production, which Robinson now forbade anyone else to touch without permission. Even when he was acting in a scene, he insisted on switching it on and off himself. There were the surveillance cameras recently installed in the building on approval from a security company. This deal was fixed up by Cookie as an indulgence to Robinson. Robinson referred to them as his electronic eyes and spent hours sitting in front of a bank of screens set up in my editing room, idly monitoring what all of us did. Watching them, he said, was as calming as gazing at a fish tank. His favorite angle was from the camera on the roof that gave a high view of anyone entering or leaving the building. Then there was his own personal video camera, the one he made me use in the basement to film the continuation of the work that started with the slapping of Lottie. I accompanied Robinson into the streets to find his pickups for these sessions, standing to one side as he settled terms. He must have explained what they could expect because none complained afterwards. The first one we took back with us, the three of us walking in awkward silence. Later the arrangement was refined by having the pickup join us at the factory. Robinson spent this waiting period in a frenzy of nerves, worrying the person wouldn't show up. Sometimes he tried it with boys. He preferred them from the tough proletarian milieu, usually 17 or 18. He kept his clothes on, being embarrassed by his lardy flesh, and gently undressed them. The women he used were usually gentler. All were treated with equal courtesy until frustration bred rage, and then he started to hit them. Occasionally this led to a brief satisfaction, more often to further frustration. These extracurricular sessions added another twist, the darkest yet, to Robinson's squibby power games. He boasted to me after one of his more successful attempts, "I play with them, I pleasure them, but I never fuck them." This was because Robinson was rarely capable of sustaining an erection. Robinson's chief pleasure came from watching these basement sessions on tape, sessions I keep reminding myself that I agreed to film for him. It required the selective eye of the camera to transform his ponderous beatings. Violence that often looked clumsy and stilted in execution took on a sleazy grace on screen. But like anything else, these sessions were unpredictable affairs. It did not occur to me before that there might be such a thing as a disappointing murder. I'd previously assumed that once the final threshold of any taboo had been crossed, complete freedom awaited, that the act of admission into the secret chamber brought its own satisfaction. This, of course, was not the case. Our work was subject to the same awkwardnesses and embarrassments as any human exchange. With practice, and because of the uncertainty of relief, the rituals became more elaborate, developed from violence into torture. Robinson's expression as he studied racked bodies was one of almost gentle scientific inquiry. He talked to his victims all the time, never more tenderly than when inflicting damage. His gestures acquired a perverse consideration. His actions were not so different from a lover's. Sometimes when I looked at Robinson upstairs, holding court at the kitchen table, pigging out on an endless binge, I saw nothing of the man who took such delicate, even fastidious care with the administration of pain. The slap, the ejaculation of blood from the nose, the search for the perfect and always elusive frozen frame. Like astronomers, we became stargazers, creating our own constellations. These stars of our dark movies never saw the result of their work. They were paid off and not asked back. When we succeeded, we were touched with a guiltless wonder. In spite of the elaborations, these sessions retained a core of simplicity and complicity, lacking in the accelerating confusion of what I came to think of as the upstairs world. On the screens in the cutting room, images from the separate compartments of our lives. On one, Lottie and Irma in a scene from Robinson's increasingly beleaguered film. On another, private footage of Robinson's victim, suspended by the wrist, strung up like a punch bag, with Robinson, his breath wheezy, dealing out pain. When he was pleased with the material, he gripped my neck with clumsy affection. On a third screen, a tape of an old movie recorded off TV. Beyond that, the bank of surveillance monitors.
Is able to do. I think he's going to be elected to that body as well. Whether I am or not, I mean, I'm very happy that you're a witness to how I feel.
Sometimes I drove myself out to wander the city in search of my wife. Bank cash machine still functioned, a sign that some things outside were still working, though the transport system had packed up entirely. The house in St. John's Wood stayed shut. I filmed it and filmed my steps back to the earlier house where we had lived together. I walked through the centre of the city, those parts that were still negotiable. The bookshop was half gone, all the books in the basement damaged by flood. Veronica had a sign in the window saying their shop was temporarily closed. Rep and Dennis's office in the mews off Wardour Street was for sale, the building patrolled by guard dogs. I looked in the lit windows of restaurants for her, knowing that these were the last of our days. I saw myself caught in some kind of time slip, an invisible crevice, watching helpless as she sat down to dine with Robinson. Jaunty, ironic Robinson. Robinson of our fuck your wife. I saw cracks in the pavement of Mead Street. I watched Humphrey Bogart dying in High Sierra, saw a hand clutching a number 8 bus ticket. I searched the tape for some sign of my wife, a shot, a picture for her that would lock the material in place and finally make sense of it for me, but found none. Other images came instead. Many of them I cut into Robinson's film. I saw a woman swinging out her right arm, William Blake walking down Poland Street shadowed by a dog, the gunman waiting on the grassy knoll. I saw all the doors in my life save those with her. Blind Borges wrote, I saw a tattered labyrinth, it was London. I saw myself as a child standing at a window, and the shadow of my mother, her voice saying, come away now. Cookie and the sly look of the wild feral girl. A moving walkway at Gatwick Airport, tank maneuvers in the desert. I saw the children I never had. Marlena Dietrich telling Orson Welles, your future's all used up. Traffic lights changing in empty streets. I watched a game show host position his guests on the camera mark. A Texaco station on a road out of Felixstowe, overhead a jet plane on its penultimate flight before crashing. I saw Jermaine Greer fuck Warren Beatty. Lottie and Ian on the sofa, a first edition of For Love and Hunger. I saw Princess Diana's sideways look to her husband on her wedding night. Broken glass on the hard shoulder, train tracks running east of Poland. I saw a photograph of Rainer Werner Fassbinder directing Veronica Voss. Watched George Best send a goalkeeper the wrong way. In the wake of a power cruiser, children run on Hampstead Heath, test crash footage of wired-up dummies in cars, Brendan Behan drunk and roaring, at least I don't fuck my own dogs. The wall against which the Ceausescus were shot, weeds on a building site, the rolling credits of a TV comedy, The Last One, the slap of the Thames against London Bridge, cars cruise high above the narrative, the pavement outside the Magdala Tavern, Robinson in Dresden, Dirk Bogarde shopping alone, a dropped glove, the only person not laughing in an audience, a tie my father wore, engine oil stains and painted white lines on concrete, a line of poplars on Breeden Hill, a woman who was in a tower block, shop dummies floating the Grand Caledonian Canal, the hum of an empty refrigerator, Ruth Ellis's botched hanging, the one that Pierpoint wouldn't talk about, a smile of invitation never followed up, a politician lying, tweezers on a dressing table. I saw the false entries in Donald Crowhurst's log, a line from a song, much older now, with hat on drinking wine, the white chalked outline of a body once mine on a pavement, from on high, the chalk blurring in the rain. The house was still connected to the mains. Television reported nothing but disasters and evacuations. One channel stopped broadcasting anything except old cartoons, and I wondered if it was evidence of a military coup. I taped more material to add to our project. Even on television there was a feeling that things were nearing their end. A newscaster broke down and wept. I took our project apart and started again, seeing at last how it had to go, the logic of each cut, not only in relation to the one before and the one after, but every other cut, so that the film would cease to become linear and sequential, and the images would transcend their assembled order, to become simultaneous. Our film would run in space, not time. All it needs is for him to come, to see it, to give himself to its end. He'll come soon, I'm sure. I imagine him, his empire in ruins, and the deluge already begun. I see us playing out our last act on a barge in the basin of Little Venice, me filming Robinson engineering his own destruction, the slash of the razor blade, the clean cut, the unblinking gaze of curiosity, watching his shoes fill with blood, his slit wrist waxy, hanging over the shoes as they fill. The only important thing, says Robinson, is the myth one invents for oneself. Robinson will make sure I am his witness. And as the rain falls, and when I look out, the sky is ablaze, and a convoy of planes drones overhead, and the barge slips its moorings, orders Robinson order me a final request, and we move from the basin down the canal. This catafalque bears Robinson to the river that has risen to meet us. The boat drifts between the drowning houses of Soho, and we pass that way one last time. Overhead a forked red sky, and then the whole raft of Soho breaking from the rest of the city, and the smoke and the fire. Robinson, the dirty rover of Oxford Street, gone in the rupture. And gradually the shades come out, the spirits of the place, the immigrants of the night, and the district moves like a huge, nearly submerged island down into the swirl of the river's midstream, and then seawards past what was once Tilbury. Then the shades are released and float into the black sky until only Robinson and I are left. The toe caps of Robinson's shoes are opaque now, as filmed as his eyes. Rough seas ahead, the waves starting to crest. One larger than the rest crashes down onto the bow. Somewhere nearly lost on the wind, the mournful boom of the foghorn, a sign to release him to the waves. Robinson's white arm held aloft, as though in valediction, the last I see of him, until the green swallows him. Come away now. The old spy's fate. James Jesus Angleton thought, only fragments remain, the rest so hard to retrieve. Life makes no more sense now than it did then. However much was forgotten, it was always an old spy's fate to remember. He remembered long nights of tough decisions in the room at the desk, blinds down, dry reasoning to justify cutting a man loose, followed by bad conscience that soured the whiskey. He He remembered always being impatient for the next drink, alcohol and nicotine his great mistresses, downing half and rubbing his mouth in the same way he had half a century earlier, after drinking pure spring water on the school run called the Leader, one clear blue day in the Malvern Hills. Not a Yank at Oxford, but near enough. ELO's Mr. Blue Sky was one of his favourites. He remembered saying, "They're setting him up." He'd done the same many times, set a man up. He remembered a cardinal, a future pope, skittish after 3 glasses of wine, saying, "Welcome to the labyrinth." He remembered thinking, once you understand the principles of betrayal and negotiation, there are only certain well-established tracks. He remembered saying, "You think Nazir is working for 6, but couldn't recall the context." He remembered being never happier than on solitary fishing trips, drinking beer in a country bar with the Duke for company. Legend had him down for highfalutin dandy, master of ambiguity and reader of poetry, where he saw his real taste as simple: catalogue clothes, detective stories and coke. The Brits he knew didn't understand popular culture. Hindsight let him see what he hadn't then: another old spy searching his room, noting the neat, sparse regularity of his personal possessions in contrast to the favoured chaos of the working method. A stage set dressed for effect, lowered Venetians, pools of light, wreaths of smoke, towers of files, and that huge desk. He remembered splendid hangovers and monitoring signs of his rebelling body, ticking them off and reacquainting himself with old friends such as Philby, who agreed Washington restaurants were so bad that, in his words, "One is more or less reduced to liquid, shall we?" He remembered doing his best thinking drunk, drinking for many reasons apart from the obvious of what the alcohol did. Test the boundaries of self-control while loosening some of the constraints. How close had the great traitor been to blurting, "Jimmy, old boy, I'm in a hell of a hole." He remembered a lifetime of dead secrets that lay scattered in his head like dried husks of grain. He felt older than Methuselah. Let's see what we get to. Sometimes a page turns in the middle of a sentence. Okay, yeah, okay. Okay, O'Grady, a big man once, stood in the empty carriage of the silver train as it moved faster through the long tunnel from St. John's Wood into daylight at Finchley Road. He wore an overcoat that looked like a man that rarely did, and the battered holdall at his feet was far from full. He stood awkwardly, waiting for the doors to close, blinking at the light after so long underground. After West Hampstead, the train travelled a ridge. Slate sky bled the colour from the view. To the left he could see the tower of the Kilburn State Cinema, like a small finger of Manhattan stuck into the London skyline. O'Grady felt his stomach contract and thought of riding on, but he got out at Kilburn, pausing to watch the train move away down the long straight track. He couldn't remember if the carriages had always been silver. He took the stairs down to the street. He was still unfamiliar with the process of everything, and whatever he did felt like it was at the wrong speed, even handing in his ticket to the unmanned booth. Outside, the 2 railway bridges, cutting the road at an angle just above the station entrance and booming whenever a train passed over, were his first familiar landmark. To his left, Shoot-Up Hill ran up towards Cricklewood. To think he had once aspired to Cricklewood. O'Grady turned right. The Kilburn High Road had been a ditch when he left, and still was from what he could see. He wondered if Moran's, where he'd had his first job, was still there. It was, the same. The rest of the shops looked as fifth-rate as ever, and the street had not lost its air of having long since given up. Traffic was clogging up in both directions. A white van parked half on the pavement blocked the way, its orange tail lights winking in unison. O'Grady had not seen indicators doing that before. Apart from that, everything looked the same. It was a shock to find so little changed. From what he'd read, there was supposed to be a boom on. Further down on the other side was the Black Lion. He'd favoured the Black Lion after being barred from the Roman way for brawling. Inside reminded him of the ice cakes of childhood treats. It was more the size of a church than a pub, with several tall rooms. There had been music on Friday nights, Irish bands over from Belfast and Dublin, singing mournful country and western. Most of them stayed at his sister's. There had been a barmaid too, with artificial red hair, lacquered to perfection, which meant she would only let him take her on all fours so as not to muss it up. He'd never found out who told his wife. It was soon after opening and the place was empty apart from a couple of biddies in a corner, chasing bottles of stout with what looked like sweet sherry. He'd not meant to go in even after he'd crossed the street. The barman was a surly lad more interested in his paper than pouring Guinness. O'Grady asked for a Jamison's too, to give him something extra to do. Once they'd jumped when he'd stood at that bar. Everything was much more expensive than he remembered. Tickets, drink, food. He seemed to have shelled out a small fortune for not very much. From what he could see, nobody paid him any attention. Once his whole life had been about making an impression, not necessarily a good one, more a matter of leaving his mark, which is what he had understood by using his fists. Now he'd grown invisible, which was how he wanted it. He walked Kilburn's back streets for half an hour, sobering up. Then he went back to Tony's for his bag, which he'd forgotten. He needed to get off on the right foot with Molly. She was taking him in when nobody else would. He walked past the house a couple of times. She'd had a new sign done. Or maybe there was a boom on after all. The trees in the street had recently been lopped right back, and in their knobbly brown hardness looked like pillars of old turd. The house was taller than he remembered. Standing before it, he felt daunted by what lay ahead. Small days of best behavior under the disapproving eye of his sister. He rang the bell. Molly took her time answering. Even before she opened the door, O'Grady knew he was in the wrong. He was late, and she would smell the drink on him. "There's no red carpet if that's what you're thinking," was all she said by way of a greeting. O'Grady crossed the threshold. The mosaic floor he hadn't given a thought to since leaving. In his day it had always had 2 or 3 pieces missing, and sure enough they still were. He stood in the hall gripping his bag. He had no explanation to speak of. Most of the time now he found he had nothing to say. Molly didn't even look at him or ask how he was. "Your old room's empty," she said. "It's let usually, so the electricity and heat are on a meter. 50 pences and pounds is what it takes. I'll be leaving to visit Mother at 5. It was an instruction, not an invitation. They would take the bus as Molly disapproved of the tube. His old room was in the eaves. There wasn't much to it. A few sticks of furniture, a view of rooftops and television aerials. He'd grown up there, his mother letting room to lads from Ireland, most of them over on digging jobs. At some point the place had started calling itself a hotel, and 1 or 2 men in suits, travelling salesmen, began to be seen in the dining room. His father, from what he could remember, had never been mentioned. All O'Grady knew was he'd gone ahead of them to England, but had moved on by the time they arrived. This was what was commonly known as an Irish divorce. There were rumours of Canada. O'Grady lay on the bed and waited for time to pass. He had taught himself not to think, stripping his mind like an engine or a gun, not bothering to put it back together. The Museum of Loneliness is a follow-up to an entirely non-existent project called the Perimeter Fence, 1996 onwards, which remains the equivalent to an empty field in the internet, an exercise in entirely invisible cultural mapping. Constantly busy but with absolutely nothing to show. The Museum of Loneliness is intended as a more visible project. It's about returning to underground activity in a spirit of decommission and non-commission, in opposition to the cultural exhaustion of conventional systems. It being notable how those media have confronted the information revolution by becoming more conservative, by offering only more of the same, at the cost of any margin. A Museum of Loneliness is therefore anti-commission. It also acknowledges that the primary modern relationship is with the screen, the electronic screen as well as the psychological screen. It may be everything or nothing. It may barely exist, or everyone may get to hear of it, and both stances are equally valid. It starts at the opposite end of .com. If there was a moment of conception, then it was on an airport bus on the 29th of June 2010 to Tegel, Berlin. Printed on a t-shirt was the legend, "Constant risks, return uncertain." And seeing the t-shirt, and looking around at the bus and everyone's luggage, and all of us in a state of transit, I thought, oh, a museum of loneliness. And most of us on the bus had our laptops with us, or iPads, and certainly we all had mobile phones. And it was an obvious moment of realization, seeing how the digital revolution had exploded everything, leaving us in this state of perpetual change, professional and personal. Just as in our real lives we've become defined by non-places and transit, by utopian visions in a state of supermodernity in which people are always and never at home. Where people once defined place, now place defines us, everywhere lonely and not lonely, hence a museum of loneliness. I sat in the airport while the flight was delayed, and I sat in the airport while the flight was delayed and jotted down some things that such a museum might be. A museum without windows and walls. Museum as attitude. The Museum of Loneliness is a roving parasite. The Museum of Loneliness travels economy. The Museum of Loneliness is not sad. The Museum of Loneliness is covert and an agent of communication. The Museum of Loneliness is everywhere and nowhere. The Museum of Loneliness is not funded by the CIA. The museum has many affiliates. The Museum of Post-Cinema, the Museum of Disappearances, the Museum of Boredom, the Museum of Idleness, the Museum of Regrets, for which there is no building large enough, and the Museum of Possibilities, and of course the Museum of Doubt. The museum will produce a biographical dictionary of the forgotten. The Museum of Loneliness understands that life operates at a variable offensive. The museum maintains that individuals and groups are made up of lines, that we are analog rather than digital, and that history should be read as migrations and life is a process of demolition. The Museum of Loneliness is not only about what you put in, it's what you take out. The Museum of Loneliness is a modern nomad. The Museum of Loneliness is most at home in the departure lounge. The Museum of Loneliness is not the finished article. The Museum of Loneliness believes daytime TV is the final frontier. The Museum of Loneliness believes in call waiting. The Museum of Loneliness makes map reading errors. The Museum of Loneliness is white space. The Museum of Loneliness is anti-pantheon. The Museum of Loneliness is about the familiar shared experience because people like looking at what they know. The Museum of Loneliness believes the artist is overrated. The Museum of Loneliness believes institutional thinking no longer reads the modern world. The Museum of Loneliness takes after a J.G. Ballard footnote when he said that deep assignments run through all our lives. There are no coincidences. However, some dispute that this line is original to Ballard, and it was in fact borrowed by him from an episode of Charlie's Angels. The Museum of Loneliness believes the lone gunman. The Museum of Loneliness has many affiliates, but no one true love. The Museum of Loneliness will ask Leonard Cohen how lonely does it get, knowing that Hank Williams hasn't answered yet. The Museum of Loneliness exists in the realm of a post-cinema. With the image bank exploded, it behoves someone to start reassembling. Discipline of selection is the key to the first age of the internet, with so much to choose from, how to decide on anything. Production is no longer enough. The Museum of Loneliness believes anonymity is the new celebrity. The Museum of Loneliness operation, outside and beyond the commissioning process, is like a detective agency for erasing cultural memory, reverse archaeology. inventing narratives for broken artifacts before returning them to the Earth. Freelance curators replace the private eyes of film noir myth, replace artists, a pointless accumulation of lists, documents, deleted DVDs, deservedly lost books, the anti-pantheon where the fault lines of the anti-pantheon where the fault lines of history are revealed. The journey to the site of the action becomes the action. The point is always to cut before the first line of the approved script is shot. The Museum of Loneliness likes postcards, certain newspaper cuttings, found footage, 8mm diaries unsourced. Museum of Loneliness projects have no beginning or end. They overlap and contradict each other. Often they are no more than the excuse for a visit to an obscure railway station, a deserted volcanic island, a meal in an empty restaurant beside the harbour in an out-of-season resort. Hackman eating Keitel's head. Hackman eating Keitel's head. The desire to see again Magwitch eating all the drinks and drugs on Bogart's chin.
find ways of losing ourselves. We all find ways of losing ourselves.
The museum, there's a museum called the museum, old kind of Roman artifacts and things. He would have an interesting story. He used to make model soldiers.
Lead?
Yeah. Well, he's lonely.
Okay, as I said, this is slow reading because there's no punctuation. Flickers. Lee Marvin walking low angle through LAX, footsteps like gunshots. Sound of wind in the trees in blow-up. Driving shots through the windscreen in Vertigo. Kim Novak asking Kirk Douglas about shaving in Strangers When We Meet. A woman's blink. Rodeo ground in Lusty Men. Number of fucks in the history of cinema. on and off screen. Fritz Lang saying in the end, it is necessary to finish what one has started. Ray Milland's vision in The Man with X-ray Eyes. Orson Welles' hair, overcoat and shoes in The Third Man. Psycho Plug Hole. Psycho Plug Hole. Warren Oates singing in Bring Me the Head of Alfredo Garcia. Magwitch in the Graveyard of Great Expectations. Lou Gallagher flipping his jacket to show his gun in The Killers. A Man Cutting In on Tuesday Weld. The Ghostness of Anna Karina and the Pretty Soldat. Christopher Walken back from the dead. The Loneliness of Diane Keaton in The Godfather. All work and no play in The Shining. Keitel's head hitting the pillow as the Ronette Stark Be My Baby. Dean Martin's hat in Some Came Running. Eastwood's Chipped Tooth. Genevieve Bujold's Eyes. The Treehouse in Swiss Family Robinson. The Eaves of the Attic in The Night of the Hunter. Death in Cinema, Palace of Dreams and Mausoleums. Ingrid Bergman cooking eggs in Viaggio in Italia. George Sanders' Boredom and Jacket. George Sanders' Boredom and Jacket. Pick Up on South Street. Bresson's note on the ejaculatory force of the eye. Jean Moreau's shoes in The Diary of a Chambermaid. Last Walk in the Wild Bunch. Sound of a pump action gun being worked. Karina's Wobbly Cycling in Banda Pa. Peter Lorre's Oyster Eyes. Plane passing over Poets Square in Performance. Three young girls walking down an Icelandic road. Ralph Amico being asked who he is in Kiss Me Deadly. Quiet of suburban streets in Badlands. Sly look of actress in Un Chien Andalou. Terror of the mountains in Track of the Cat. Country gas station in Two-Lane Blacktop. Eroticism in Woman of the Dunes. Intimacy of theft in Pickpocket. Yancho travelling shots. James Stewart having to act with Dion. Street shot of unknown actress looking fed up in Upper Junction. Dan Durea passive. Nuns in films. Noise of chainsaw. Claudia Cardinale's voice. Any face in a crowd. Fassbinder, Assassination and Foreign Correspondent, Umbrellas in Films, Morricone's music, all the drinks and drugs ever taken by anyone who worked in movies, cinema as narcotic. Bronson's fear of tunnelling in The Great Escape, train arriving in the station by the Brothers Lumiere, Jane Birkin looking through a keyhole, the fevered eroticism of Clara Calami's hands in a Sessione, Robert Vaughan catching flies. Emptiness in The Left-Handed Woman, Burton drunk driving in Virginia Woolf, The Queen's Haircuts, Insecurity of Rita Hayworth, Nina Ventura crossing a track in Le Deuxième Souffle, Straub Huyer's Framing, Sue Lloyd to Michael Caine, Do You Always Wear Your Glasses, Sleet and Motorway Cafe in Le Cercle Rouge, The Gaunt Officer in the Battle of Algiers, Graham Greene's cameo in A Day for Night, Edith Scobb's bandage in Les Yeux Sans Visage, Vulnerability of Kurt Robb's serial killer in Tenderness of the Wolves, Musical narcissism of Warren Beatty, Drea's vampire, blonde Russian actress in Ballad of a Soldier, Lee J. Cobb's cliff-top death in Man of the West, The Last Romantic Couple, the predatoriness of Connery's Bond, restlessness of Cassavetes, The Killing of a Chinese Bookie, the shirt Zuzu buys, The Man in Love in the Afternoon, busted careers and Cutter's Way, Delon's line in Nouvelle Vague, I inspired derision, the desolate look of James Mason, Saddest Eyes in Cinema, Sam Shepard and Dylan's line, While I'm standing in line in the rain to see a movie starring Gregory Peck, Trams in The Man with a Movie Camera, Wells's remark that most directors don't get found out, The Wasted Life of Louise Brooks, Stray Food on Bogart's Chin in Accident, Nigel Green in the Face of Fu Manchu, Actors' Suicides, The Bizarre Cinematic Trip of Valerian Borochik, Hackman eating ice cream after cold turkey in French Connection 2, Missing Tiles in the Floor in Rosemary's Baby, The Desire to See Again films I hated at the time, Coutel's Camera for Godard, The 15-Year Gap in Buñuel's career, Photographs in films, The Magnificence of Delphine Seyrig in Daughters of Darkness, Wednesday and Big Wednesday, Tracking and Wavelengths, Silk Stockings, On Screen, Out of Season Coastal Resort in Les Valseurs, Nostalgia of German expatriates in Hollywood for European weather, Anger's mapping of other Hollywoods, Niven's Smirk, Zapruder's 8mm film, The Greatness of Don Siegel, The Switchboard Operator and Her Cat, Richard Boone in The Night of the Following Day, Snow in McCabe and Mrs. Miller. The belief by dull practitioners that cinema cannot be transcended, surveillance image diaries recorded by machines, unadventurous use of music in film, dominance of picture over sound, the dreariness of critical orthodoxy, Godard's Histoire du Cinéma, director's Prospero, video, DVD, the fact that films don't say the end anymore. Cut